It's late August 1857, and the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, which is this massive financial institution based in Cincinnati, just suddenly collapses.
Slightly folds, yeah.
Right. And within days, the panic just spreads across the telegraph wires. Banks in New York start suspending payments in gold and silver.
The credit markets freeze up entirely.
Exactly. Credit freezes. And by October, the crisis has jumped the Atlantic. Businesses in Liverpool, London, Paris, Hamburg, they're all going bankrupt.
It's domino effect.
Yeah. The global capitalist economy is essentially experiencing its first truly synchronized worldwide meltdown. And sitting in a smoky room in London, surrounded by just towering stacks of books and newspapers, Karl Marx is frantically scribbling in his notebooks.
Just trying to decode the collapse in real time.
Right.
It is honestly the ultimate high-stakes intellectual pressure cooker. I mean, he is watching the financial architecture of the 19th century just shatter around him. And he is racing to finish a theoretical blueprint that explains exactly why it's happening, before the dust even settles.
Welcome to this deep dive. We are thrilled you are joining us today. Our mission for you on this deep dive is to unpack Volume 28 of the Marx and Engels collected works.
Which is often abbreviated as the MECW.
Right, the MECW. We are going to be exploring a collection of, really crucial economic writings drafted between 1857 and 1861.
These are the preliminary, unfiltered, rough drafts.
Yeah, the rough drafts of what would eventually become Marx's magnum opus, Capital. But before we plunge into the history and the economics of it all, we need to set the tone here.
Definitely.
We need to be incredibly clear about our objective, because we are dealing with a deeply, undeniably politically charged text.
Oh, absolutely.
So we want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that we are not here endorsing or taking sides on Marx's political or economic theories.
Right. And nor are we taking a stance against the bourgeois economist that Marx critiques in these pages either. Figures like Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, or Adam Smith.
Right. We're not picking winners here. Our goal is strictly to impartially report, decode, and convey the ideas contained in these fascinating historical source materials.
We are acting as intellectual archaeologists today.
I like that, yeah, intellectual archaeologists. Because what makes these manuscripts so captivating, and they're widely known by their German editorial heading, the Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie.
Or usually just the Grundrisse.
Yeah, simply the Grundrisse. What makes them so interesting is that they offer this rare, behind-the-scenes look into a thinker's mind.
Right, you aren't reading a polished textbook.
No, not at all. You are watching a massive theoretical architecture being constructed, debated, and revised right in the middle of a global financial earthquake. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Well, to really understand the Grundrisse, we kind of have to roll the clock back a bit.
Okay, let's do it.
Because Marx's intense economic focus in 1857, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It wasn't just sparked by the panic.
Great, he was already working on this stuff.
Yeah, the sources point us back to letters Marx wrote to his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, as early as January and February of 1851.
Oh, wow, so 6 years earlier.
Exactly. In those letters, he is already beginning this exhaustive, critical teardown of the reigning economic champions of his day.
So 6 years before the banks started failing, he was already laying the theoretical groundwork. What specifically was he targeting in those 1851 letters?
He was going after two major pillars of classical economics. The first one was David Ricardo's theory of rent, which was actually intimately tied to Thomas Malthus's law of diminishing returns in agriculture.
Okay, let's define those terms for a second, because, rent in 19th century political economy doesn't just mean the check you write to your landlord on the first of the month.
Right, it's a bit more specific.
So how did Ricardo and Malthus actually view rent and diminishing returns?
Well, Ricardo, building on Malthus, he argued that rent exists because land is not uniform in quality. So imagine you have a brand new society. The first farmers are obviously going to cultivate the most fertile, easily accessible land.
Makes sense. Let's call it grade A land.
Exactly. But as the population grows, society has to produce more food. And the grade A land is all taken, right?
Right.
So farmers are forced to cultivate grade B land, which is maybe rockier or further from the river.
And because it's worse land, it takes more labor and more capital to get the exact same amount of wheat out of it.
That's the exact mechanics of it, yeah.
Yeah.
So the price of wheat on the market has to rise to cover the higher costs of farming that grade B land. Otherwise, no one would bother farming it.
Right, you just lose money.
But the farmer on the grade A land, He is now selling his wheat at that new, higher market price, even though his costs are still low.
Oh, I see.
So that extra unearned profit the grade A farmer gets, that is rent.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. But where does Malthus come in with the diminishing returns?
Well, Malthus's law of diminishing returns argued that this was a permanent, natural trajectory.
Like an inescapable thing.
Right. As you add more labor and capital to a fixed amount of land, the extra output you get essentially shrinks over time. You are constantly forced onto worse and worse land.
Which drives up rent, enriches the landowners, and I guess squeezes the profits of everyone else, like the industrial capitalists.
Precisely.
That paints a very bleak, almost mechanical view of human progress. Like, you're just inevitably grinding down into less and less productive dirt.
It really is a pessimistic view.
So why was Marx attacking this specific idea back in 1851?
Because Marx recognized that Ricardo and Malthus were treating a specific technological and social condition as if it were like a timeless law of physics.
Ah, right.
In those letters to Engels, Marx points out that their theory completely ignores the historical development of science and agronomy.
Oh, of course. Because
Yeah.
what happens when chemistry introduces new fertilizers?
Exactly. Or what happens when new agricultural machinery is invented. The so-called worse land might suddenly become highly productive.
Right. Technology changes the math completely.
Yeah, and Marx realized that classical economists had this habit of taking the temporary limits of their own era and just calling them eternal natural laws.
Which is a huge theme we're going to see him return to repeatedly.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned he was targeting a second major pillar in 1851 as well?
Yes, the quantitative theory of money circulation.
Okay, what is that?
This was heavily championed by economists who believed that the amount of money in circulation directly dictates the prices of commodities.
Okay.
The basic idea is that if you suddenly double the amount of gold or currency in a country, the prices of all goods will just simply double.
Because the money is just a veil, like a ratio.
Right.
But that seems somewhat intuitive, though, right? I mean, if everyone suddenly has twice as much money, merchants are obviously going to raise their prices. What was Marx's issue with that?
Marx saw it as fundamentally backwards. He argued that it isn't the quantity of money that determines the prices of commodities.
Okay.
It's the value of the commodities that determines the quantity of money needed in circulation.
Wait, run that by me again?
Sure, we'll get really deep into his theory of value later, but Marx essentially argued that goods have an underlying value based on the labor required to produce them.
Right.
Money is just the universal equivalent used to express that value. So if the total value of goods being exchanged in the market rises, more money will just naturally be drawn into circulation to facilitate that exchange.
Oh, I see.
And if the velocity of money, which is how fast a single coin changes hands, if that increases, you might actually need less physical currency to circulate the exact same amount of goods.
So he's looking at the classical economists and essentially saying, you guys have the whole mechanism in reverse.
Completely in reverse.
Like you're looking at the surface effects and confusing them for the root causes.
And that is basically the defining characteristic of his work in the 1850s. You know, after the failed European revolutions of 1848, Marx went into exile in London.
Right.
And for much of the 1850s, he practically lived in the reading room of the British Museum. He filled just dozens of notebooks with excerpts from every economist he could get his hands on.
Just massive amounts of research.
Exactly. And by the summer of 1857, so right before the panic hits, he makes this concerted attempt to outline his grand economic theory.
And he does this by directly critiquing two incredibly popular contemporary economists, right?
Yes, the French economist Frédéric Bastiat and the American economist Henry Charles Carey.
Bastiat and Carey, I mean, they don't have the modern name recognition of an Adam Smith, but in 1857, they were highly influential.
Oh, massively influential.
What were they arguing?
Well, they represented what Marx called the vulgar economists.
Vulgar economists.
Yeah, meaning they only looked at the superficial appearances of the market rather than its deep structural roots.
Okay.
But what's really interesting is that Bastiat and Carey were politically totally opposed to each other.
Really? How so?
Bastiat was a fervent free trader. He believed that if you just remove government intervention and let international free trade flourish, the interests of capital and labor will naturally harmonize.
Okay, so a classic laissez-faire guy.
Exactly. Carey, on the other hand, was writing in America, which was, at the time, a developing industrial nation trying to compete with Britain.
Right.
So Carey argued for strict protectionism and tariffs, claiming that protecting national industry was the only way to achieve economic harmony.
Wait, okay. If Carey is fiercely pro-tariff and Bastiat is fiercely pro-free trade, how can Marx lump them together? They sound like total opposites on policy.
They are opposites on policy, yeah.
Yeah.
But they share the exact same underlying fantasy,
Which is?
the fantasy of harmonious capitalism. Both of them believed that the capitalist system is fundamentally harmonious and beneficial for everyone.
I see.
And they thought that any conflicts, like strikes, poverty, or market crashes, were just external accidents.
Like someone messed up the perfect system.
Exactly. Bastiat blamed government meddling for the problems, while Carey blamed British imperial dominance.
But neither could admit that the antagonism between, say, the factory owner and the wage worker was built into the very DNA of the system itself.
Right, so Marx used his drafts on Bastiat and Carey to kind of clear the brush, to say whether you use free trade or protectionism, you're just choosing different ways to manage a system that is inherently contradictory.
That makes perfect sense. And then, almost as if history was providing a live-action demonstration of his point, the Panic of 1857 hits.
The harmony just completely shatters.
Yeah, you have the Ohio life insurance collapse in August, and by October, it's global chaos.
Total chaos.
But I'm curious, did the crisis force Marx's hand to start writing the Grundrisse? Or was the crisis just a convenient backdrop since he was already sitting in the British Museum doing the research anyway?
Oh, he was a profound catalyst.
Really?
Yeah, the sources show that Marx and Engels had actually concluded years earlier, reflecting on the failed 1848 revolutions, that a new political upsurge would only be possible after a new economic crisis.
So they were waiting for it.
They had been actively watching for the symptoms. When the signs of general stagnation in trade, the suspension of payments, all these bankruptcies began to ripple across the globe.
He knew this was it.
Yeah, Marx saw this as empirical validation of his theories regarding the cyclical, crisis-prone nature of capitalist production.
Man, he must have felt a bizarre mix of vindication and just intense pressure.
Oh, for sure.
Because he believed this crash could be the spark for massive social change, and he needed his theoretical framework ready to explain it to people.
The letters he wrote during this period are literally frantic. He was working through the night, synthesizing years and years of research.
Wow.
But to make sense of the chaos, Marx realized he couldn't just use the methodological tools of the economists he was critiquing.
Right. He couldn't just write another book about supply and demand or rent.
No, he had to completely rebuild the philosophical foundation of how to study economics in the first place.
Which brings us to the famous unfinished introduction he drafted in late August and early September of 1857.
Yes.
This is primarily contained in what is known in the archives as Notebook M.
Correct.
And on the cover of this notebook, Marx listed a 4-point agenda for his methodology. What were those 4 points?
Okay, so first he wanted to analyze production in general.
Okay.
Second, the general relationship between production, distribution, exchange, and consumption.
Got it.
Third, the method of political economy. And fourth, the means or forces of production and production relations.
I mean, to a modern listener, that sounds like a fairly standard syllabus for Economics 101, right? Production, distribution, consumption. It sounds very dry.
It does sound a bit standard to us now.
But in the context of 1857, this was a radical departure. Why is that?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, here is where Marx makes his foundational break from classical economics.
Okay, how so?
The bourgeois economists of his time tended to treat production as this general, eternal abstraction.
Like it never changes.
Right. They thought of the physical act of producing goods, humans using tools to transform nature into useful things, as something governed by universal natural laws that applied to all societies across all of time.
So basically saying, whether you're a Roman slave, a medieval serf, or a 19th century factory worker, you're all just producing. It's a biological constant, like breathing.
That is precisely the mindset he was attacking.
Right.
Because classical economists viewed production as fixed by nature and eternal, they believed the primary task of economics wasn't to study production at all.
Then what were they studying?
They thought they needed to study distribution.
Oh, okay.
How the wealth that is produced gets shared out among the population through rent, profit, and wages. They believed you couldn't change the laws of production, but you could perhaps tweak the laws of distribution.
Okay, let's try to visualize this for a second. It sounds like traditional economists were studying how a pie is sliced and handed out.
It is like that.
That's the distribution. And they were treating the pie itself as if it just magically fell from the sky, perfectly baked by the eternal laws of nature.
That's a great way to put it.
So if someone was starving, the economists would just argue over the slicing technique. But Marx is stepping into the room and saying, No, we can't just look at the slices. We have to look at the kitchen, the recipe, and the social dynamics of the
The
cooks.
productions.
Right, the production. Because the way that pie is baked determines exactly how it gets sliced.
That analogy captures the core of his critique perfectly. Marx argues that there is no such thing as production in general.
Okay.
Production is always shaped by specific historical and social conditions. And in his case, he was studying the specific social conditions of bourgeois production capitalism.
Right.
So he argues for a dialectical unity between production, distribution, exchange, and consumption.
A dialectical unity. Okay, let's unpack that because dialectic is one of those heavy philosophical words that can easily lose people.
Oh, absolutely.
What does he actually mean by unity here?
It just means they aren't isolated silos that happen in a strict, disconnected sequence. They interact constantly and they define each other.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Look at production and consumption. You might think production happens first and consumption happens second. That seems logical, yeah.
But Marx points out that production is consumption. To produce a shirt, you have to consume cotton. You have to consume the wear and tear of the sewing machine.
Oh,
And the worker has to consume their own physical energy.
and conversely, consumption is production.
Exactly. When you eat food, you are reproducing your own body, producing your ability to work the next day.
They feed into each other in a continuous loop.
Right.
But in this loop, does Marx think they are all equally powerful?
No. And this is his vital conclusion in the introduction. While they interact, production is the decisive moment.
Okay.
Production dictates the forms of distribution.
Going back to the pie analogy, you can't distribute wages and corporate profits if you don't first have a system of production that separates wage laborers from corporate owners.
Exactly.
The social relations between the people making the pie dictate who gets the biggest piece.
And that is the linchpin of Marx's method. You cannot divorce the economy from history and social structure.
The economists of his day looked around, saw capitalists and wage laborers, and just assumed this was the final natural state of humanity.
But Marx is saying, no, this is a historically specific era with its own specific rules.
Exactly. The production relations between people who owns the tools, who does the work, constitute the true subject matter of economics.
Wow. Okay.
If you want to understand the 1857 financial crisis, you can't just look at bank ledgers. You have to look at the social structure of production that created those ledgers.
Okay, so he has established this massive, sweeping historical framework in his unfinished introduction. But to actually write his critique, to build what would eventually become Capital, he has to start somewhere, right?
Right. You can't just start with everything all at once.
Exactly. How does he actually begin examining this massive, complex bourgeois society? Because he doesn't start by analyzing the global banking system or international trade routes.
No, he doesn't.
He zooms all the way in. He looks for the absolute smallest possible unit, the economic cell.
Yes. And this brings us to the first major section of the Grundrisse, covered in volume 28, which encompasses the chapter on money and the first part of the chapter on capital.
Okay.
As Marx labored over his theory of value, pushing through the noise of the financial crisis, he discovered this fundamental unit, the economic cell of capitalism. And that cell is the commodity.
The commodity, an object,
Yeah.
a physical thing that is bought and sold, like a coat, a table, or a ton of iron.
Exactly.
Wait, hold on. We are in the middle of a global banking collapse. People are losing their life savings. Credit is frozen. Banks are locking their doors.
Yeah.
And Marx decides the best place to start fixing the world is by analyzing a coat.
I know, it sounds crazy.
Why on earth wouldn't he start with money? Doesn't money rule the world?
It is arguably the most counterintuitive part of his entire project, but it is brilliant. The reason he doesn't start with money is that money is just a highly developed, specialized form of the commodity.
Oh, okay.
You cannot have money without first having commodities that need to be exchanged.
Right.
What's fascinating here is Marx's methodological commitment. He doesn't start with high-level abstract concepts like value or supply.
Because that would be too disconnected.
Exactly. In his drafts, Marx literally writes, "The commodity is the first category in which bourgeois wealth makes its appearance." He starts with the material bearer of the economic relations.
He starts with the physical thing you can actually hold in your hand.
Yes.
Because if you start with abstractions, you end up like the classical economists, floating in the clouds.
Right, completely detached from reality.
So, by starting with a physical commodity, he grounds the entire theory in material reality. So he puts the commodity under his theoretical microscope. What does he see?
He sees a contradiction.
Okay.
A commodity has a dual character. On one hand, it is a use value. It satisfies a specific human need.
Like you can wear the coat to stay warm.
Exactly. Or you can sit at the table to eat. Its usefulness is tied to its physical properties.
Makes sense.
But on the other hand, it has an exchange value. It can be traded for other things. A coat can be traded for 10 yards of linen, or a certain amount of iron, or eventually a certain amount of gold.
But those two things, a coat and a pile of linen, are completely different physical objects.
Right.
They have different use values. You can't wear a pile of unsewn linen, and you can't really use a coat to make a sail for a boat.
No, you can't.
So how can they be equal in exchange? How does one coat logically equal 10 yards of linen?
This is the exact question Marx wrestles with, and it leads to his greatest breakthrough, which is elaborated extensively in these Volume 28 manuscripts.
Okay, what's the breakthrough?
He reasons that if two fundamentally different things can be equated in exchange, they must share a common denominator. There must be a third thing they both contain.
And it isn't their physical properties, because we just said those are different.
Right. The only common property they share is that they are both products of human labor. But here, Marx makes a crucial distinction that classical economists missed. Just as the commodity has a dual character use value and exchange value, the labor that produces it also has a dual character.
Concrete labor versus abstract labor.
Yes.
Let's break those down. What is concrete labor?
Concrete labor is the specific, useful kind of work. The tailor does concrete tailoring to make the coat. The weaver does concrete weaving to make the linen.
Okay, so tailoring and weaving are different kinds of physical work.
Right. And concrete labor creates the use value.
Got it.
But when you bring the coat and the linen to the market to exchange them, you strip away their specific physical differences.
Because you aren't comparing the tailoring to the weaving anymore.
Exactly. You're no longer looking at them like that. You are looking at them as mere expenditures of general human energy, brains, muscle, nerves. This is abstract labor.
Okay, so it's human labor viewed purely as a quantity of time and energy, regardless of the specific task.
Exactly. Abstract labor creates the exchange value. The reason one coat might equal 10 yards of linen is that, on average, they take the exact same amount of socially necessary abstract labor time to produce.
Wow. So it's like the DNA. The commodity is the cell. Inside that cell is the genetic code, this tension between use value and exchange value, driven by concrete and abstract labor.
That's a great way to think about it.
And from that single microscopic cell, the entire complex organism of capitalism grows.
It is an organic historical growth, yeah. Because once you have a society where people are producing commodities not for their own use, but to exchange on the market, you encounter a logistical nightmare.
How so?
Well, if I have a coat and I want a table, I have to find a carpenter who happens to want a coat.
Right, a barter system is just super inefficient.
So over time, the market organically singles out one specific commodity to act as the universal equivalent, a commodity that everyone will accept in exchange for their goods.
And historically, this became precious metals, right? Gold and silver.
Exactly. The commodity evolves into money.
And suddenly, we aren't trading a coat for a table. We are trading a coat for gold, and then using the gold to buy a table. The whole formula shifts.
Yes, and Marx maps this out meticulously. You go from commodity, money, commodity, which is selling in order to buy.
Right.
But once money exists, a new dynamic emerges. Someone with money can buy commodities, not to use them, but to sell them again for more money. The formula flips to money, commodity, money plus.
Buying in order to sell at a profit.
And that money plus, that self-expanding value, is capital.
Wow.
From the simple physical commodity, you grow money. From money, you grow capital. From capital, you grow the entire global financial system that Marx was watching collapse in 1857.
By starting with the tangible commodity, he proved that capital isn't just a pile of money or a stack of machinery.
No, it's not. Capital is a specific social relation between people, mediated through things.
That is just breathtaking. He starts with a single seed, a coat, or a yard of linen, and logically unfurls the entire forest of a global economy.
It really is a massive intellectual achievement.
But to fully cement this theory, Marx couldn't just build his own logical structure. He had to aggressively demolish the prevailing, accepted theories of his time that justified the suffering he saw around him.
Right, the apologetics for capitalism.
Yeah, he had to prove that the poverty and unemployment accompanying these financial crises weren't just the tragic result of Mother Nature.
Exactly.
And that brings us to his absolute systematic takedown of Thomas Malthus.
Which is such an important part of these manuscripts. Thomas Malthus was this enormously influential clergyman and political economist.
Right.
His theories on population were treated almost like a secular religion by the wealthy elite of the 19th century.
Because it offered a very convenient excuse for inequality.
Absolutely.
What exactly was Malthus arguing?
So Malthus wrote an essay on the principle of population, where he argued that human populations grow exponentially or geometrically, like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32.
Okay.
But the Earth's ability to produce food and resources only grows arithmetically, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So the math doesn't work out.
Right. Therefore, Malthus concluded, humanity is forever doomed to outstrip its food supply.
Wow.
Overpopulation, poverty, starvation, and unemployment are natural biological inevitabilities. According to Malthus, it wasn't the economic system causing the misery of the working classes, it was simply the insufficiency of nature and the rapid breeding of the poor.
I mean, it is the ultimate blame the victim economic theory.
It really is.
Oh, you're starving. It's not because I own all the land and factories. It's because you people have too many kids. It's biological math. Nothing we can do about it. Malthus famously argued against poor relief, right?
He did. He argued that giving welfare to the poor just encouraged them to breed more,
Jeez.
which in his mind would only make the inevitable starvation worse down the line. You can imagine how appealing this theory was to factory owners who wanted to pay poverty wages and not feel guilty about it.
Oh, I bet they loved it. But Marx vehemently disagreed with this.
Completely. He devoted significant space in these Volume 28 manuscripts to shredding Malthusian population theories.
How did he counter it?
Marx argued that overpopulation and unemployment are not natural inevitabilities dictated by biology. They are generated by the actual conditions of social production.
Right, tying it back to production.
Specifically, they are structural, required features of the capitalist system.
How so? Walk us through Marx's counter-argument. How does capitalism actively create poverty and unemployment, if not through population growth?
Well, Marx looked at the actual mechanics of the factory floor. Capitalism, by its very nature, is driven by the pursuit of profit, which requires constantly striving to increase productivity.
Okay, and how do you increase productivity?
You replace human labor with machinery.
Right.
In Marxist terms, the capitalist shifts investment away from variable capital, which is the wages paid to living workers, and toward constant capital, which is the machines and raw materials.
So when a new weaving machine is introduced, it might do the work of 10 weavers.
Exactly. And those 10 weavers are thrown out into the street.
So the system constantly ejects workers from the production process.
Yes. This creates what Marx called a relative surplus population, or the industrial reserve army of the unemployed.
A reserve army.
Right. This surplus population isn't created because there aren't enough resources on the planet to feed them. It is created because the machine made their specific labor redundant to the capitalist.
Wow.
And here's the crucial part. Capitalism actually needs this reserve army.
It needs unemployed people. Why?
Because if everyone was fully employed, workers could demand higher wages.
Oh, and that would eat into profits.
Exactly. A pool of desperate, unemployed workers competing for jobs keeps the wages of the employed workers pushed down.
It's a built-in disciplinary mechanism.
And furthermore, capitalism goes through cycles of boom and bust. When a boom happens, the capitalist needs a readily available pool of unemployed labor to quickly expand production.
So Marx essentially flips Malthus on his head. Malthus says poverty is a biological law of nature. Marx says, no, poverty is a structural requirement of capitalism. The system intentionally overworks half the population while keeping the other half unemployed as a disciplinary threat.
And Marx proves this isn't just a theory by looking backward.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, Marx didn't just look at contemporary 19th century capitalism to prove Malthus wrong. He looked deep into pre-capitalist history.
Because if Malthus was right, if poverty and overpopulation were eternal biological laws, you should see the exact same dynamics in all human societies throughout history.
Right. If it's a law of nature, it should apply to ancient Rome and primitive tribes just as much as it applies to Victorian London.
It did it.
Not at all. The sources show Marx dedicating an immense amount of effort in the Grundrisse to studying the earliest stages of human history.
What was your researching?
He was researching the history of land ownership and the evolution of the agricultural commune. He noted that in primitive human societies, there was an absence of class divisions. The dominant social structures were tribal ties, blood relations, and communal principles. The land wasn't owned by a private landlord. It was the collective property of the tribe.
He used a specific phrase for this early human psychology, didn't he?
Yes, he referred to the herd spirit, or the collective gregarious nature of early humans.
The herd spirit.
Right. In these societies, production was directly for the community's survival, not for exchange on a market. Therefore, the concept of a surplus population didn't even exist in the Malthusian sense.
Because if the tribe grew, they just worked more land together.
Exactly. No one was artificially locked out of producing their own food because someone else held a piece of paper claiming private ownership of the forest.
So no private property in the way we understand it, no capitalists, no wage laborers, just the commune.
Just the commune.
How did we get from that collective herd spirit to the brutal factory system of 1857?
Marx traced the long, violent disintegration of those agricultural communes over centuries. He analyzed various forms of pre-capitalist exploitation.
Like what?
Well, he looked at slave labor in antiquity, where the worker themselves is owned as a tool. He looked at serf labor in the Middle Ages, where the worker is tied to the land but owns their own tools and has a customary right to a portion of the harvest.
Right.
And he analyzed the specific features that set these older forms apart from modern wage labor. In capitalism, the worker is free in a double sense.
A double sense.
Yeah. They are legally free to sell their labor to whoever they want, but they are also free from owning any of the means of production, the land, the tools, the materials.
Ah, so they are forced to sell their time, their abstract labor, just to survive because the communal safety nets and communal lands were destroyed.
Precisely. Marx concluded that the historical breakdown of those ancient collective communal principles was the necessary historical precondition that allowed the capitalist mode of production to emerge.
You cannot have a factory system unless you first have a mass of people who have been historically stripped of any independent means of survival. The disintegration of the old communal world was essentially the brutal, necessary fertilizer for the new capitalist world.
And this historical deep dive proves Marx's earlier methodological point from his introduction. Economic laws are not eternal.
Right. Malthus was trying to pass off a specific brutal symptom of 19th century capitalism, the Industrial Reserve Army, as a timeless biological law.
But Marx used history to show that economic laws are specific to their historical epoch. The laws governing a tribal commune are completely different from the laws governing a feudal manor.
And the laws governing a feudal manor are completely different from the laws governing the global financial markets melting down in 1857.
Exactly.
It's like trying to apply the rules of chess to a game of Monopoly, and when people start going bankrupt, you just throw up your hands and claim it's a universal law of board games.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
Marx is pointing out that we just changed the board. The rules are historically constructed, which means they can be historically changed.
Yes, that is the ultimate takeaway.
This brings everything we've talked about full circle. We've covered a massive amount of ground today on this deep dive into Volume 28 of the MECW. Let's recap the journey we've taken through Marx's notebooks.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has. We started with the pressure cooker of the 1857 global financial crisis, banks collapsing, trade stagnating, and Marx frantically drafting these economic manuscripts, the Grundrisse, to make sense of the chaos.
Right.
We saw his radical methodological break from traditional bourgeois economics. Instead of treating production as an eternal law of nature and arguing over distribution, Marx realized you have to look at the historical social conditions of production itself. Production is the decisive moment.
Absolutely.
From there, we zoomed in on the microscopic economic cell of capitalism, the physical commodity. We saw how Marx identified the tension between use value and exchange value, driven by the dual nature of concrete and abstract labor.
The genetic code of capitalism.
Exactly. And from that single cell, he traced the organic evolution of money and, ultimately, the logic of capital itself. And finally, we watched him systematically dismantle Thomas Malthus's theories of overpopulation. Marx used history to prove that poverty and unemployment are not biological inevitabilities, but structural requirements of a system that constantly replaces human labor with machinery to generate profit.
He really flipped the whole paradigm upside down.
So I want to pose a question to you, the listener. How often do we today treat our current economic or social systems as if they are eternal or natural laws.
Just as the economists of the 1850s did.
Exactly. How often do we look at modern crises, whether it's housing markets crashing, persistent poverty, or technological unemployment from AI, and just shrug and say, well, that's just the way the world works?
Right. Instead of looking, as Marx challenges us to do, at the underlying social conditions of production that we ourselves have built.
It is a profound challenge to our critical thinking, asking us to recognize the historical impermanence of the world around us.
It really is. And, I want to leave you with a final thought, drawing on the actual publication history mentioned in our sources.
Oh.
Because these groundbreaking manuscripts we've been discussing, the Grundrisse, which contain the raw, unfiltered genesis of Marx's most impactful theories, the deep dives into the commodity and abstract labor that clarify everything in his later work, they were completely unknown to the public for decades.
Wait, really? They weren't published right away?
No, they sat in archives, totally unread. They were first published in their original German language in Moscow between 1939 and 1941.
Are you serious? 1939?
Yes. That is staggering when you think about it. It invites us to ponder a massive historical what if.
Wow.
How might the history of the late 19th and early 20th centuries have been different? How might the development of global political and economic thought have shifted if these foundational clarifying graphs had been publicly available to scholars, economists, and political movements from the very beginning, rather than gathering dust for 80 years?
Man, what if the architect's frantic, brilliant, coffee-stained blueprints had been published right alongside the finished skyscraper?
It's something to chew on as you look at the economic structures around us today.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Volume 28 of the MECW. Until next time, keep questioning the blueprints.